Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to talk about the process of deep charging spiritual energy. And the process is mostly the same as deep charging emotion. And that's basically because it's going to feel like an intensity type charge. So you just wanted to get it, using this technique, you want it to be as intense as possible. Alright, so we talked about how that's a little bit different from a performance type charge, in which case you want intensity but also universality. Right, so that's a little different, but this is mainly just an intensity type charge. To go over this, it's actually a little more than that too, but we'll talk about that later. But to go over this first point, deep charging spiritual energy is mostly the same as deep charging emotion, which involves multiple sessions of main charging over the course of a rolling 7-day period. So it starts off pretty much the same as charging emotion, right? So in this case, you would focus on God, right? So charging spiritual energy, like we said, in its most direct form and using the main technique requires you to focus on God, right? So it's a very unique subject, right? You have to focus on God in order to charge spiritual energy in this form. And so you would focus on God, right? And you can use whatever deity, right? But the focus still should be the place in your mind that causes you to feel that spike, the largest spike of purity, right? So we call that God. So that's unique for spiritual energy, but you would focus on God, hold a positive intention, right? And then go in and out of a transcendental state while telling a story that maintains that spiked feeling. So the positive memory, the subject associated with the positive memory basically is going to be God. And the frequency or the intention you're using to connect to God would be the frequency, but it would also charge in a way that has the effect of connecting you to God more. So we could say your short-term memory would be filled with spiritual energy because it has basically has parameters in the memory that increase your connection to God the more positive that memory gets. So using that terminology, we could basically say that your short-term memory is filled with spiritual energy, right? And as you fill your short-term memory with spiritual energy, right, it puts you in a spiritual mood, which causes you to behave more like Jesus. And as that short-term memory fills, it creates a boosting effect, which allows you to connect to God even more, or charge spiritual energy even more. So basically, that's the process of deep charging, right? You would perform the main charging technique, and you can even pre-charge for a little while if you feel you need to, and then main charge. Perform that intermittently. We talked about that on an earlier video. But you can perform it intermittently throughout the day, and then you're going to notice over a rolling 7-day period as you do it intermittently throughout the day for a couple of minutes over and over, you're going to notice you're feeling it more, right? And it's growing, it's becoming more intense. And then you could go longer and longer as it gets more intense without negative memory getting in the way. And so that's basically deep charging it, right? And if you stop focusing on God, so remember spiritual energy, at least charging in this form is very unique. You have to focus on God. So if you stop focusing on God for a 7-day period, then the spiritual energy is going to discharge. Right? It's going to go away. And then, roughly after a 7-day period, so I'm not sure. It could change, but, just to keep with our framework, after a rolling 7-day period, presumably you would lose all the spiritual energy, and you would go back to normal levels of spiritual energy, which are charged by your body. Right? But if you keep focusing on God and keep charging intermittently, you would deep charge it more and more and more, and you will feel it more and more, and it's going to feel more and more amazing, right? And you're going to notice how your body responds to it. It's just a wonderful feeling. Like I said, when I do it, it feels like when I reach the really high levels, it feels like my aura is sparkling. I just get that sense. So you'll probably get it too once you start doing this. But there is more to it than this, right? So this is the main process involved in charging spiritual energy. But there are some differences because remember, spiritual energy is about connecting to God. So it's a transcendental connection. It's not exactly a frequency. So there are some slight differences between deep charging spiritual energy and deep charging emotion. So one thing and that actually gets to here, but before I get to this point, one thing I actually wanted to mention was that when you deep charge a positive emotion, right? We talked about how any negative experience you have when you produce a negative intention at some point, that's going to get stored in your short-term memory, right? And if you do it even a little bit in a prolonged way, or in a powerful way, we could say, it's going to charge negative emotions and store it in short-term memory. And the more of it you have, the more that's going to dampen positive emotions, or your ability to charge positive emotions. It's going to be like a weight that pulls it down. And that's because they're like we said earlier in the chapter, they're antithetical frequencies. And so the more negative experiences you have, the more they're going to get in the way of your deep charge, right, of positive emotions. And this is a great thing, right? But the more positive experiences you have, the more they're going to dampen your ability to charge negative emotions. And so, because spiritual energy makes you feel all positive emotions good, enhances your ability to experience all positive emotions. Negative emotions, when they get stored in your short-term memory, also kind of dampen your spiritual energy to a degree, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's almost that simple, right? But it's a little bit more than that, right? And that's basically what I want to get to here. So spiritual energy is more sensitive to negative intentions than emotional energy. And what I mean by that is that spiritual energy, what basically dampens it and weakens your ability to charge it, it's almost the same as saying negative emotions or negative intentions, right? So intentions that charge your subconscious at a negative frequency or charge negative emotions. And so the more negative emotions you charge, you're going to notice that it's getting harder and harder to charge spiritual energy. So they're antithetical to each other. Negative emotions will dampen your ability to experience spiritual energy. But in my experience, and this is very subtle, right? It's a very subtle difference. But in my experience, I feel like if I get angry, which is very rare, but if I get angry or upset, it doesn't feel like it's dampening my spiritual energy in the same way it's dampening positive emotions, right? It doesn't really seem to affect it that much, although it doesn't allow me to feel the sort of presence of God as much, you could put it that way. In other words, I don't feel that pure sense of joy and happiness that you get when you draw near to God. I don't feel it as much because it's a little bit diluted or dampened by the negative emotion, right? Because I'm feeling both, and the negative emotion is kind of messing up how much I feel the presence of God. But it doesn't quite, like I said, it's very subtle, but it doesn't quite feel like it's dampening it in the same way it's dampening negative emotions, right? Or negative emotions don't quite feel like they're dampening my spiritual energy in the same way they dampen positive emotions when it comes to deep charging. There's something else that happens. There's something that I do that feels more like it's not just dampening spiritual energy, right? It's like it actively pushes it away, right? It'll weaken my connection to God. So if my connection, let's say this is the source, right? So this is God. It's like the sun. And I'm here, there'll be certain things that I do where it feels like now I'm here, right? If I feel a negative emotion, it feels like I'm here, and this will be my connection to God. And if I experience a negative emotion, it'll feel like I'm still here, but the negative emotion just gets in the way, so I don't feel the presence of God as much. But there's something I do that makes it seem like, now I'm here. And it's not just feeling a negative emotion. So that's what I want to kind of emphasize. That's the difference between that's important to when it comes to deep charging spiritual energy. In terms of what blocks it and gets in the way of it, it's not exactly the same as negative emotions, although it's almost the same, right? So what is this thing that is actually antithetical spiritual energy and actually pushes it away? You cannot charge both, right? You can't do this thing and then and deep charge spiritual energy at the same time, right? You have to choose one. And so basically it can be a thought or a behavior, so behaviors still require thoughts, but specifically it feels like it gets pushed back even more when it's a thought that's expressed as an action, right, as opposed to just a thought. So it is a phenomenon that occurs on the subconscious level, which we generally call sin, right? And so I know a lot of people might say that I'm just kind of putting this in the framework of Christian theology or whatever, or in other religions have the same thing. But I guarantee you when you deep charge spiritual energy, you're going to notice this too. There are certain things that actively push spiritual energy away. And so to go over this, sin is a term generally attributed to thoughts or behaviors that actively push spiritual energy away. And I didn't mean to say exactly what I already wrote on the board. But yeah, so these are basically just specific types of things, right? So in other words, this is almost synonymous with just producing intention that causes you to charge a negative frequency. Almost. But it's, like I say, when you charge spiritual energy and you start deep charging it, you're going to notice this, right? It's not quite the same. There are some moments where I can feel a negative feeling, but I don't really feel in my heart like it's pushing spiritual energy away. It does dampen my ability to feel it, but it doesn't actively push it away. But then there are certain thoughts and feelings I have. Usually it's when I engage in some type of action, right? It'll actively push my spiritual energy away, and I can feel it, right? Because once you get used to that feeling of spiritual energy, right, focusing on God, and you get used to walking around with that feeling, you're going to notice that there's certain things you do that make that feeling stronger and push it away. So in those cases, you're not actively doing, right, they're using the main charging technique, right? You're just going about your day. But when you charge it so much, it's going to become so strong. You're going to feel it so much more, right? It's not going to be as subtle anymore. So I said that before, that when you charge spiritual energy, you have a much deeper perception of right and wrong and morality, and you understand why things are right and wrong more. But when you do something wrong, it's going to feel so uncomfortable for you. It's going to be like a shock. You're not used to it, right? To charge spiritual energy, which we'll actually get to that in a moment, but to charge spiritual energy more, you actually have to go for a while without doing things that are bad because they push spiritual energy away. So when you do those things that are bad, as defined by God, right, not by me, or the conscious mind, or any one of us, you're going to notice that that feeling actively gets pushed away. And you're going to notice that there are only certain things you do that just push it away, right? And those are what we generally call sinful behaviors. So, like I said, sinful thoughts are simple behaviors, right? So, for example, stealing, if you were to do this, right? Stealing, right? Lying to others, hurting people, treating them badly, looking down on them, right? Having intense amount of pride or arrogance, wanting revenge on people, being lustful. You're going to notice also one that I think is probably very rare. We don't really have the opportunity to do that in the modern world, but being lazy, right? Working is a very holy thing. You're going to notice when you work, you're going to feel that feeling of spiritual energy coming stronger. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But if you're lazy, right, you're going to notice it pushes spiritual energy away. That is sinful, right? And so when you engage in certain types of behaviors like that, and you get used to that feeling, like I said, when you charge spiritual energy and you walk around your day with it, you're going to notice there are certain behaviors that actively push it away, right? Those are sinful behaviors. Now, those behaviors and those intentions will also charge negative emotions too, but again, it's a very subtle difference. It's not quite the same, right? For example, there have been times when I've gotten upset that I didn't really feel like it pushed spiritual energy away. I didn't have that same feeling. So we go over this next point. Sinful or immoral behaviors push spiritual energy away, while moral behaviors pull spiritual energy in. So that's very, very important, right? Like I said, when you have high levels of spiritual energy and you walk around throughout your day, and you're going to notice your spiritual energy reacting to certain things you're doing, right? And this is very important because, again, I feel like most people they haven't examined their heart enough to really recognize this. Again, these are the tools God has given us to know right from wrong and to know how to connect to Him and be aligned with His Spirit, right? If the feeling is just more subtle when it's not charged at higher levels. But when you walk around your day, not only are you going to notice certain behaviors actively push spiritual energy away, but you're going to notice that certain behaviors actively pull it in. So they're not exactly the same as the main charging technique, right? But these behaviors will still ostensibly pull spiritual energy in. They'll still help you to charge it. And that's because you're not actually charging a frequency, you're connected to God. And you'll produce a particular type of intention when doing this anyway. when engaging those behaviors anyway, which still quantize your subconscious and still will have an effect on your connection to God. But those types of behaviors, for example, will be altruism, right? So giving to people, when you give to people in need, right? You're going to notice like when you give to someone, right, who's in need, you generally feel a good feeling. You're like, man, I felt good, right? When you give to, let's say you give to the poor, to the homeless. I know some people might feel like, oh, they could sort of help themselves. And that's a little different because your intention is going to be different in that case, right? And you might not feel spiritual energy increase if you do it for the wrong reason. So we're going to talk more about that a little bit later. But your intention, the reason you're engaging in some behaviors, because when I perform an intention, when I perform a behavior, there's obviously an intention that I'm producing as I'm engaging that behavior. And that intention is going to determine what causes, if its spiritual energy gets stronger, you charge it a little more from that action, or if it gets pushed away. So, but if I have the right intention, which again, we'll talk about that later, basically it's when you're doing it has a full expression of love, or has an act in service of God, right? When you do it for the right reason, you're going to notice not only do you feel the frequency of altruism charge, right? So you're going to feel the emotion we generally associate with altruistic behavior, but you're going to feel something else, right? You're going to feel, it's like a twofer, right? So you're going to feel the emotion of altruism, and you're going to feel the purity. There's like a holiness to it that you felt for a moment you felt it rather, not, I won't say necessarily strongly, it depends on how much you deep charge spiritual energy, but you feel it too, right? For a moment you feel something else, something that feels very, very pure and very good. That's spiritual energy. That's the little bit of spiritual energy that you pulled in from that good behavior, from that moral behavior, right? So when someone is sad and you say something to make them feel better, if your intention's in the right place in terms of why you did that, you're going to feel good in your heart, right? Not only will you feel whatever frequency is associated with helping someone, maybe sympathy or cheering, whatever we think of when we think of cheering someone up. So you're going to feel the emotion, but you're going to feel something else too. You're going to feel this goodness inside of you. And it may go away after a while, but just for a moment, you're going to feel it a little bit, right? That's spiritual energy charging, right? So you can also charge spiritual energy by engaging in moral behaviors. So like I said, altruism, helping people, giving to people in need, right? Cheering people up, protecting people, right? Protecting children, things like that. Giving money to others, or giving money to the poor. So yeah, basically when you engage in positive behaviors or moral behaviors like that, right? You're going to notice that you get a little more spiritual energy. The lion's share of the spiritual energy will still be from the main charging technique that we talked about, but you can also bring it in by engaging in what we call moral behaviors, what God would call a moral behavior. And now the reason all of that is so very important is for this reason, and that's to reach higher levels of spiritual energy, you'll need to also engage in moral behavior. So that is very important, right? Deep charging spiritual energy isn't just about holding an intention and charging all day, right? It's more than that, because your spiritual energy is very sensitive to what you do. It is not a frequency, right? So it's not the same as when I just charge, let's say I charge the love emotion, and now it's harder to charge the hate emotion. But if I charge any negative frequency, it just dampens my ability to feel the love emotion. Spiritual energy is more sensitive than that, right? If I engage in some immoral behavior, it's going to actively get pushed away, right? And so I can't really charge it as much. So, like I said, the lion's share of deep charging spiritual energy would involve this, but to get more, because I can't just sit around all day charging energy, and I'll actually talk in a moment that I couldn't do that anyway with spiritual energy, but I can't just sit around all day charging spiritual energy, because I have to go out in the world, I have to do things, interact with people. My spiritual energy is responding to all of that stuff, right? Regardless of how much I'm no longer paying attention to it, is there the whole time responding to my intentions. And everything I'm doing throughout the day is getting stored to short-term memory. So not only do I need to make sure that I'm not actively consuming a whole bunch of things that through the reflection principle cause me to charge negative energy or negative emotions. But I also have to avoid sinful behaviors. So behaviors that actively push, thoughts and behaviors that actually actively push spiritual energy away. So if I stop engaging in sinful behaviors, as defined by God, and I also start engaging in moral behaviors, that's going to pull more spiritual energy in. That stores more spiritual energy in my short-term memory, and it's going to deep charge more and more and more. So the combination of moral behaviors plus my main charging sessions is going to allow me to deep charge spiritual energy to huge levels, right? And so it's a combination of these two things, right, to reach the really high levels of spiritual energy charge. And that's how you deep charge it properly, right? And like I said, you are going to notice this. So if you want to reach the really high levels of deep charging, just do exactly this, right? So use the main charging technique. Like I said, that's where most of it's going to come from. And then throughout your day, especially if you're kind of a sinful person anyway, or a person who engages in things that you know to be sinful, and if you're trying to turn away from that, that's a wonderful thing, right? If you're trying to come to God and stop doing those things, this will help you do that, because this is like a compass that God has placed in your heart to help you know right from wrong, and which things are sinful and which are not, right? So it's going to be much easier on top of the compulsions, the way spiritual energy compels you to behave. On top of that, making you not really want to sin anyway, you'll also be able to avoid it because of this feeling, right? So as you go about your day, and trust me, you're going to listen to if you listen to like dark music, and it doesn't just have to be like dark hip hop, right? Which that's the most obvious one. But I imagine certain songs, I don't really listen to the radio or pop music or anything. There'll be some videos, I watch some Christian YouTubers, so many videos they say about how there's evil in pop music, which is true, right? We're going to talk about that in chapter 5. But, I'll hear certain songs, I'm like, man, that sounds demonic. Or like, that sounds so dark, right? And you're going to notice when you listen to that music, right, you're going to feel your spiritual energy get pushed away, right, from listening to that music. Or watching certain movies, right? You're going to notice it get pushed away. And similarly, if you smoke weed or do drugs, we'll talk a little more about what happens. That lowers your spiritual energy. We'll talk more about that in chapter 5 too, and toward the end of this chapter. But those things actively push spiritual energy away, and you're going to feel it, right? And then you're going to notice, like, okay, let me change my life around. Let me start helping people and doing things. And if you do it for the wrong reason, which we'll talk more about it later in the spiritual trade-off effect. But if you do it for a wrong reason, it is possible to engage in that type of behavior for a selfish reason. We'll talk about that later. But if you do it for the wrong reason, you're not going to notice spiritual energy come in that much, right? But if you say, man, I just want to do this for God, right? You're going to notice that spiritual energy comes in like crazy when you engage in moral behaviors. And then you're going to start, because it feels so good and it feels so right, so it feels like the righteousness of God, right? You can feel the righteousness of Jesus when you do that, and you're going to want more of it because it feels so nice, right? And when you change your life and you start living in this way, you're going to start trying to live in a way where you engage in moral behaviors fairly regularly, and you use this, let's say in meditation or whatever, preferably listening to Christian music, deep charging positive emotions, you're going to notice you feel better and better, more fulfilled, more happy. This is kind of the glow that born-again Christians usually have, right? You're going to have that glow to you, right? And if this is new for you, other people are most likely going to notice it. Like, something just seems different about you. It's like you have a glow. When you live in that way, that's because you're deep charging spiritual energy, and your connection to God is increasing, right? So, one last thing I want to mention. I talk about this later too in the chapter, but if you keep engaging in sinful behaviors, right, what they do is push spiritual energy away. And so if you keep doing it, they push it away more and more and more and more, right? And then you're going to deep charge in a way where you're going to, I don't know if deep charging is the right word, but suffice it to say your short-term memory, is going to have a very low amount of spiritual energy. So you're going to go to abnormally low amounts. So your body charges a normal amount, but if you deep charge it, it still can push it away even lower than what your body normally charges, right? So sinful behaviors can actually block it and sort of override the charge from the body in a way. I know it maybe sounds like a contradiction, but that's what I feel happens. Because I have felt that before. And when you get to the really low levels of spiritual energy, it's going to be hard to feel happy at all, right? And there's almost no positive emotion you can feel that powerfully because your connection to God is so weak, right? And but you will be able to feel all negative emotions very strongly. And so that's what happens when you continuously engage in sinful behaviors. And you can still stop, right? So if you stop, right, doing that, then your spiritual energy starts to replenish and you'll feel better again. And this actually causes, so we talked about in chapter 12 about kind of the back and forth effect, or sometimes I call it the yo-yo effect. I didn't put that in this version of the book. I did put it in the earlier versions of my book, where you go back and forth from shock charging, right? That can also happen with spiritual energy. Because when people sin too much within a short amount of time, their spiritual energy, their connection to God weakens so much, right, that they can't feel anything good, right? And you will notice this. Let's say that you lie a lot, right? You're used to being a liar, right? It's gonna start to make you feel bad. You're gonna feel so guilty. In Christianity, we call it convicted of that sin. And it's gonna start to bother you like crazy. And now it's like you can't feel good because you keep lying. One that really affects people today, I believe, and we'll really talk more about that. We'll talk more about it in chapter 5. But I usually work at a cable company, so we call it adult titles, right? So watching adult titles and engaging in that behavior, which you know what I'm talking about, that pushes spiritual energy away, right? So that a lot of people try to have this idea or this attitude that it's okay, or our body needs it, right? We're just satisfying our body's urges or whatever, right? I'm going to talk about that too, because I had experience with that, and I asked Jesus about that, how that works, and I did get an answer, and I'm going to explain it to you guys later. But suffice it to say, listen to your heart, right? When people engage in that behavior, they feel bad, right? That's because your spiritual energy, you lost a little bit of spiritual energy because you did that. You can feel it. Don't take my word for it, right? You feel it in your heart. People are constantly like, well, what does the Bible say? What does this say? Do other people do it? It doesn't matter, right? God put actually, I shouldn't say it doesn't matter what the Bible, but we'll talk more about the Bible later in chapter 4. So the next chapter, because it's something I believe God wanted me to tell you guys about it, right? A misunderstanding about it. But for the moment, we'll just say that God has given you the tools to know right from wrong. Use them, right? They are there for a reason. And when you engage in that behavior, you feel it. Like, you feel bad, right? You may not know why you feel bad. You may not understand why you feel bad. You just know you do, right? And a lot of society, I'm kind of talking about something I was planning to talk about later, but a lot of society, they try to reason with that feeling using intellectuality and their logic on why it makes sense, but nothing they do changes this fact. There's nothing you can do, right? So they feel bad when they do it, and when you do it a lot in a short time, it's like you feel worse and worse and worse, right? That's because your spiritual energy is dropping. And when people stop doing it, even if they feel miserable, that's coming from the body, not the spirit, but we'll talk about it later. When they stop, they feel pure, right? That's because spiritual energy is replenishing again. So very important, right? If you can continuously engage in sinful behaviors in a short time, you're going to lose a lot of spiritual energy. And to build spiritual energy, you have to stop engaging in sinful behaviors and engage in moral behaviors along with this idea of focusing on God, right? And those would be your born-again Christians, which is why we're always focused on God or focused on Jesus, because you can only really charge this in this way while focused on Jesus. You can't focus on any other subject, you have to focus on God, which is how we see Jesus, but you can't focus on any other subject to charge spiritual energy. And because it feels so wonderful, us born again Christians, we tend to be focused on Jesus all day, right? And it never gets tiring, never gets old. It always feels wonderful. And so yeah, people who do that will have that glow. So the last thing I want to talk about, and this is kind of something we'll talk about later in chapter 10, there are other aspects to charging spiritual energy which involve your relationship with God. So we're going to talk more about a relationship with God, what that means in the next chapter, chapter 4. But there are things that would cause me to charge spiritual energy, certain behaviors that wouldn't cause you to charge spiritual energy, right? So there's more to spiritual energy than just your intention, right? There's a more unique and personal component of it that's just related to you, and that has to do with God's plan for you and what he's asked you to do and things like that. So we're going to talk about a relationship with God in the next chapter, but we're going to really go over that, and that's what I was saying before. That has to do with the more purpose-based aspect. Right now we're just talking about charging spiritual energy in terms of making it more intense, which is really for the purpose of emotion, feeling the goodness of God. But when you have a relationship with God, there will be ways that you serve him and things that you can do, which don't force you to stop doing this. It's just going to be harder. That's just the world we live in. So your spiritual energy is going to drop as you do that. But serving God is still a priority. So it's not going to be like, if I'm serving God, I got to make sure this is the highest thing possible. No, that's not. This is wonderful. Yes, I whenever I can, I like to deep charge spiritual energy. It feels amazing, right? And when God asks you to do certain things, if you try really hard, you might still be able to do it while keeping this. For God will never ask you to do anything that is sinful, right? He'll never ask you to do something that feels like it's pushing spiritual energy away. I've never experienced that, right? It's always going to be something that pulls spiritual energy in, but it might be hard, right? It still might be hard to do. Like God has asked me before, I'll talk more about this stuff later, but he's asked me before to sort of minister to people, like, which I don't really consider myself to be that, but he's asked me to do that, to tell certain people about Jesus, help them have a relationship with him, certain people in my life, and that can sometimes be difficult. Oh, they might think I'm crazy or something like that. That's not so, like, I know I should help this person, help bring them to God. So that brings in spiritual energy, right? It's definitely not. God has never asked me to do something that I felt was sinful, or that was sinful even according to this definition of it. But it can still be challenging and can be difficult. Now, in the process of me doing that, or if I've had spiritual experiences even to writing this book and making these videos, right? And it could be a lot of work, and I'm stressed and things like that. So I'm not charging spiritual energy during that time, right? But I'm still carrying out the purpose God gave me. So doing what God told me to do. So spiritual energy, maintaining high levels of spiritual energy is not the priority. The priority is being aligned with your relationship with God. You do this part when you can and try to live in this way when you can, right? And this is not what New Age is about, because this is the actual proper way to connect to God. But in New Age, they do this thing where they're like, try to be happy all day, and if you're, feel negative or whatever, you're attracting negative things into your life. No, that is escapism, right? That has nothing to do with what true happiness is. We'll talk more about this in chapter 10. But true happiness comes from your relationship with God, right? And there's more to it than this component of it, but this is still an important component of it, right? But yeah, so I just want to make that caveat. We're going to talk more about what it means to have a relationship with God, and then that's the main component. Then when you would combine that with this stuff to feel more spiritual energy, the main thing is not to do sinful things, right? That we'll talk more about that. That's the main component of having a relationship with God. But yeah, I believe this is a solid framework, which is going to help a lot of people connect to God and navigate their relationship with him. So yeah, that's it for deep charging. In the next I forget what I talk about in the next video. What's in the next section of the book. Might be whatever it is, right? So whatever it is, I'll talk about what's in the next component of the book, the next section of the book after this. But yeah, that's it for now, though. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.